Thank you very much, Evan, and thanks to the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to present. So my name is Prateep Nayak, and I am the University of Waterloo, and also representing the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership on small-scale fisheries. I'm going to take around 10 minutes to talk about the approach that we are focusing on in terms of managing small-scale fisheries communities. Okay, the starting point is, we want to talk about small-scale fisheries being in a position to contribute to the society, to the economy, and multiple things in different contexts. But at the same time, we also talk about small-scale fisheries being very vulnerable in different ways. The key question that we ask in the work that we do is if the small-scale fisheries were only vulnerable, over generations, they would have faced by now. There's something that got them going. There's some strength, there's something good power and capabilities that they have used to struggle, respond, and survive until today. So the unique approach that I'm going to talk about is how do we rely on those strengths and capabilities of small-scale fisheries communities and try to see that the communities can move towards a more viable situation. And I'll talk about that in more detail as well. Of course, the way we understand vulnerability and viability is just not in the sense of economic and related stuff, but also include all aspects of human life. So that ranges to social, political, ecological aspects of small-scale economy. Just to say, in the recent publication, we talk about what could be various sources of vulnerability. You could see, I'm not going to go into great details of this, but you could see that vulnerability could range from anything from how to believe to poverty, to identity, to language, to being involved in social struggles and losing collective action and institutional loss can take various other things. So these kind of support the idea that vulnerability in small-scale fisheries is really situated in multiple domains within those communities and years. So the basic approach is then to understand vulnerability and viability as they are linked to each other, and not just look at vulnerability and viability separately. Often we kind of try to treat vulnerability and viability separately. So the approach is vulnerability to viability, which means that in no given point in time, a particular small-scale fisheries communities, and for that matter, any particular community is not going to be fully vulnerable or fully viable. There are some elements, by using social ecological systems approach, some components of that system are going to be more viable, being viable, and others are going to be more vulnerable. And the task is to identify, on this vulnerability to viability continuum, where are the different components of that particular system, and therefore what can be done in terms of making progress towards that. The approach we take is a five-fold approach. We're engaging in co-production of knowledge that can really help in understanding, not only understanding vulnerability, but also making the transition to viability a possibility, and then taking that knowledge and creating a repository or an information system, and then synthesizing all of that information to inform policy, practice, and theory, and also looking at various capacities that can help in transitioning towards viability, and of course mobilizing all of that knowledge for theory, practice. So those are the five. There are two different, related or two different aspects of that. Again, because of lack of time, I'm not going into details of that. But you could see in the four bubbles, we talk about various conceptual domains that can help us navigate through the understanding of vulnerability and especially the transition. So as you can see that the four conceptual domains kind of represent particular areas. and they help us, look at, well-being livelihoods to, power and politics to, social ecological resilience, adaptive capacity, and of course, when engaging in, innovative, interactive and multiple governance arrangements that can help us in moving from vulnerability to manufacture. Again, not going into details, so part of that approach is to look at, what constitutes vulnerability in that. So we're looking at three, related concepts again. The first one is to look at resilience, the level of resilience, which is the adaptive capacity to respond to, situations or crises in particular communities, could be a measure of, vulnerability or vulnerability. The second one is really the capital. So the five human, physical, natural, social, and financial. And these capitals kind of represent the various capacities of the community to respond to vulnerability and move and transition towards viability. Access to capitals in a way and potentially improve economic status, social position, cultural identity, ecological security, and political purpose. Those are the five capitals. The third one is the well-being. Really, puts the vulnerability to value perspective into a kind of a nice framework where look at the material, the relational, and the subjective aspects of vulnerability and value. Well-being is something that helps us kind of conceptualize the vulnerability and value into these three levels. And then there's a methodological approach to that. So what is the methodological approach? So again, because of lack of time, I will not go into details, but I will give you some links to for the review the material. So talking about a case, so saying what does a V2V or vulnerability to viability case look like? And of course, we have a template that we're using, which is called AZTI, which looks at various levels of crisis and talks about developing a common typology to learn from competitive markets. The case study that we are talking about in our view is place-based, comprehensive, inclusive, diverse, and dynamics that helps us to capture the context in terms of the issues, challenges, themes, opportunities, responses, the history, the current, and the future. So the basic idea is, if there is not an approach that holistically kind of captures all aspects of vulnerability and vulnerability and the transition possibility in the context, is not going to be as successful in the future. So therefore, a case study which is place-based, comprehensive, inclusive, diverse, and to see that the case studies are actually available for realizing the process of transition into vulnerability. At this point, so this is the global partnership. Through this, we are starting to kind of move towards building really case studies, primary case studies in multiple places, especially in Africa and Asia. At this point, there are 121 scientists, practitioners, and policy community actors that are involved in this globally. 38 universities, 22 government and research institutions, 25 NGOs and CSOs, and a large number of 65 graduates, a few undergraduate students, and other early career researchers involved in this research, spanning 26 countries. Really, the top right-hand corner is where this initiative is present currently to its members, and the bottom left-hand corner is the 12 case countries where we are building this V2V transition history to see what is possible in terms of moving from vulnerability to viability. You can follow us and get more material from the links that are available on the slide. And I will stop here. If you have any questions, I'm happy to We're going to go through the presentation, though, there, and that way we will actually have time for this. And next up is Julia NAKAMURA.
Thank you very much for your feedback for the my presentation is going to be about fundamental rights and competition in the international waters. And this is part of it's a book chapter that I'm preparing for an episode that Katia is also organizing. I think that's why I'm not here. I'm just trying on. And in this book, we are essentially collecting information assessments from various countries on what's the legal and policy for smallscale fisheries that are relevant for smallscale fisheries and which foster the implementation of the smallscale fisheries guidelines. The book was also drawn from a paper that we was published last year, in which we did a rapid framework to assess 25 countries and have a better equivalent preliminary understanding of how the extent to which this national policy legal instruments are aligned with the guidelines. And so this chapter is part of the edited book. And I'm going to just go through how I structured it, and I would also welcome inputs and comments on that. But essentially, I start by outlining the importance of understanding small-scale fisheries in the context of international law jurisprudence, because it is something that for some countries may be vital, especially for countries that follow common law traditions where decisions held by courts are considered as primary sources of law. So this is also fundamental in understanding how courts are protecting small-scale fisheries rights, recognizing those rights. And the idea with this chapter is to look at the international jurisprudence. So it's a selection of courts decisions that were held by international tribunals, also arbitral tribunals, and also the Human Rights Committee, which is one of the human rights treaty monitoring body that is responsible for monitoring the implementation of the international covenant on ongoing physical rights. And that this committee helps communications on how the covenant is being implemented and whether there has been violations or not. So
How is that? The further is here, so I can resume share. I'm moving to the project start.
just the land, just now that we'll figure it out. Yes. Thank you. Okay. So I need to go to the. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of the book that we're working on and the coverage of the different countries and also the Pacific island country region involved covered. So the presentation will go through these 4 points essentially. I start by also emphasizing on the fact that for the most part of the international human rights law, the focus has been much more on the rights of the people in land, and that has been changing more recently to it's more legal scholarship focusing on the linkages of the application of black and human rights to the private spaces and the right to marine the human rights for small issues carrying their operation. And the question is more of considering the protection of human rights also when they are seen, not only when they are outside their votes and So there are some examples of the literature that has been addressing these issues. And yeah, this focus has now been more and more towards the human rights-based approach, and that has been really one of the significant contributions of the voluntary guidelines for keeping stable small fisheries, which was adopted in 2015 under the WTO, which follows the human rights-based approach and all the standards fisheries and has focused also on equitable development. So taking due account of the especially to requirements of vulnerable groups that include women, children, and migrants within small fisheries, taking that into account, ensuring that we participate in all relevant continuing processes. And also another important component was the declaration on the rights of planters and other people working in rural areas, which was adopted in 2018. And it's a declaration that explicitly applies Article 1, Paragraph 2, and clarifies that it explicitly applies to people engaged in artisanal and fishing. So that this declaration is also very important. It should be used and read in combination and conjunction with the guidance. And in this chapter, I also explore the approaches for protecting the rights of small fishers, and that includes human rights, as the human rights-based approach is very much focused, but also other rights. But of course, there are some attention to be given when we're looking at the rights-based approach and having to also
Oh, I wasn't. Okay. So yeah, in this, I think. Okay. Well, so these are the international court decisions that I selected, but there's also some decisions held by the Inter-American Courts of Human Rights, which speak more. They are largely covering indigenous and tribal peoples and ethnic minorities. So I thought that was also important because it touches upon the recognition of of the importance of fishing for their values and culture, and how that also speaks to their human rights, and particularly the right to food, the right to property, which is related to tenure rights in those decisions. And also there was one case that was very interesting, in which the court did not rely only on the need to have official, formal, and documented proof to determine that the subsistence fishing practices existed. So I thought that was also interesting to highlight, to note that the court noted that the subsistence fishing practice, by its very nature, especially given the remoteness of the area and the small, thinly spread population, is not likely to be documented in any formal way in any official record. And they recognize the subsistence fishing rights on that in this case. So okay, well, I think this is more or less what I wanted to show, like the work that is still being reviewed. So I'm still working on this book chapter, but this is what I'm aiming to present in the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. And I'm so sorry about all the technical issues that you persisted through.
Plus the light and you supposed to think that the people can
Okay. That's very good.
yes.
But you're up. I would like to introduce our her, Katia FRANGOUDES.
So it's just a question mark. Can French liners in the English Channel remain exclusive liners? I will. So our geographical area is between the English Channel and the Celtic Sea. Our objective, in fact, was to gather local ecological knowledge of fishers, with the objective of the deployment of acoustic device in the area. In fact, it's a transdisciplinary project with scientists, social scientists, biologists, ecologists, and the Fisheries Committee. So the idea was to go there and understand where fish are fishing, why if fish is there, and so on. So geographical area is the Iroa Sea, where in fact we have what is in green, if you can look. It's a marine protecting area. It's the French type of marine protecting areas. It's the Iroa's marine park, because in fact in France, for the moment, we didn't choose to do closed areas of activities, but we have areas where we manage the different users. And so the liners, our fishers there are targeting sea bass, pig simmering, pollock, and red porgy. So I make some mistake on the name of the name. We have in the area the local fisheries committee and a market organization having a very long story created by the liners. The call is liners of the tip of Brittany, and they were based here in India. The chair of the liners is in the other room of this organization. And the issue, in fact, came out during interviews that can we be now exclusive liners or not? Because liners, they were creating, it's important to remember, their objective was to make the difference between aquaculture simbrim, sea bass, and wild sea bass. Their way, it's small scale boats, so less than 12 meters, using hooks. And they want to show to the consumer, informed consumers about their environmental friendly activity. They have decided by their own to reduce the day of fishing, apply a seasonal closure during the reproduction period from January up to end of March. And the most particular, it goes to provide the transparency of the project, of the practice, by putting something on the year of the, not the year, but anyway, of the fish, and the consumer can follow the boat when it goes. And that started in 93. I mean, it's not something new. And all the members of the organization sign a chart. The main story, it's here that they didn't promise, but they commit that they will be exclusive liners. So this organization came out in 93 because at that moment, at the local fisheries committee based in Anticipatory city, had a secretary, a guy who finished the commercial school in France, and he knew how to do this type of label. And the chair, who is selected by the fishermen at that moment of the fisheries committee, was a very well-known person locally and with a strong personality. So finally, I think that these two elements play an important role at the moment of the constitution of this organization. So when we went, with Eider there and Charlene to interview fishers, I had that organization in my mind. So I wrote in one of our books the case of this organization. And when I was there, I was quite a little surprised on the current situation. In fact, what fishers they told us is that Simbas behave change. They were fishing exclusively Simbas, big size of Simbas, and so on. And nowadays they have more and more difficulties to find Simbas around the area where they are operating. So Simbas behave change. Okay. Then they tell us, we asked them how they explain this reduction of Simbas in the area. So the idea from fishermen was Simbas cannot find any more food, or they change their migration due to water temperature or other factors. Yesterday I was speaking with Sandrine, who is also liners, and we know that in France we put in the water some very, very huge trawlers that they are targeting the food. I mean the fish that who is a food for Simbas, and we are thinking that. Maybe the fishermen are thinking that there is an impact of that. And of course, all these big boats, some of these big boats, they are not French owner, they are Dutch owner. So it's again seen as the enemy. Then, how fishers they were adapting this new situation, because finally Prateep was speaking about vulnerability. Now we are really in a situation where fishermen are vulnerable. They were exclusive long liners, and they have to find solutions how to earn their life, as they say. They tell us. So they identify new fishing grounds far away from the land, 75 miles up in the large, where it's not anymore is still territorial French water. In some of the other areas, they are already UK territorial water in the Channel Sea. And they went to wrecks. So they were fishing there. And the quotation I put, in fact, is all this fear of security, for security reasons. They go 70 miles up. Nobody can see if they have any accident or something. And these people are operating alone. The other option was to diversify their species. So they went to the pollack and red pork. In Ondierne, that is possible, but not in northern part of the Irois Sea. So they fish, they move from bass to pollack. And what it was the surprise for them is the red porky that we didn't have in the area. And since the last 5 years, we have a lot of these species, and it's big species, it's valuable species. So on the income, there is not really change for them. There is change for fishers of the other harbor. And then they start to use multiple gear. The other solution is to use multiple gear. But some of them, as we know, Europe, it's very well regulated. Some of them, they don't have the license to diversify the activity. Because at that moment, they thought that they don't need to pay more to the Fisheries Committee because the bus was there and it was sufficient for them. And then there is this institutional change that was impacting the activity. We introduced in Europe a new regulation for Simbas and in France in 2017. No. And since 2019, the fisher organizations are responsible to manage Simbas. So we have Europe allocated TAC to TAC to France, and for the two regional sea, Gulf and Bay of Biscay and English Channel. And we find out that the rules are more restrictive in the British Channel than in Gulf of Biscay, in Bay of Biscay, because the scientists think that fish stock is more in danger in the other part, and it was more pressure from the UK government, in fact, at EU, to take a decision to regulate Simbas. So we apply since the seasonal closure applied by the Liners Association is now became an obligation, but just only for them and not for the other gears, which means the pelagic trawler. And the local committee based in Ondierne disappear, and they move to another city close by, but it's 1.5 hours from the harbor. So it's for them, this is a pity. There is not relation anymore with it's not the fishing organization. So implementation of quota system, the fishers, they got, the quota was based on their historical rights. They account the 4 years of historical rights. If you didn't have, you don't have, and you will not have access to these Simbas anymore. Pollack, it's also another species that France has a very big quota, and this quota is never reached. So for everybody else is never reached, we don't have a problem. But for fishermen, there is a problem. So this new situation, in fact, creates difficulties to the Liners Association, and exclude, because now all fishers not using using other gears are excluded. They cannot be anymore members. And then, in fact, for the fishers, members of the association, it seems that the new EU regulation on transparency of the product is another reason that people went out of the organization, because their initiative was innovated and original in 1993, but not anymore today, because every fisher can put its own tag on the and go and sell the fish, and there is the transparency everywhere. So the people there, the people we met, they call for new rules, new regulation rules for Pollack, because as we don't reach our quota, there is no problem. But there is a problem because the last boat, they told us that they cannot fish anymore. So they call the Fisheries Committee to introduce some new regulations. They don't know exactly what, but the fishermen try to give some ideas, like apply the minimum landing size as we do for sea bass. Again, to have the seasonal closure of Pollack, almost at the same period with sea bass, because the reproduction season is at that moment, and or to apply territorial closures. And they ask also to limit the catches of recreational fishers, like we do for sea bass. We initiated recently a survey on with recreational fishers to understand if limit the number of fish that they are allowed to catch per day, it will be something difficult for them or not, or they will accept it, because the issue is, do they accept it? Because for sea bass is for sea bass per day per person on board, but for Pollack there is no anything, and the fisher, we discussed that just before to come here with the Fisheries Committee, and they tell us no, for them it cannot be viable this such decision. For them, they should apply the system that is existing in other area, in Bay of Biscay, where we divide in fact the license on boats dependent of the species, less dependent of the species, and accidental catches. But fishers, they don't agree, because this measure will satisfy all the fishers, all the gears, because during the winter, netters, which are also small-scale fisher, are working during the seasonal closure that they apply these people. And so, but for the committee, the problem is how to satisfy all the people, and we are under this situation. That's all. I was.
Thank you so much, Katia. Next, we have Eneko BACHILLER joining us virtually. Let me just set you up, okay?
Yes, thanks.
Thank you. Okay. So you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. Let me know if you see the slideshow. No?
Yes, but I'm just moving it over. Do you have a second display set up here?
Okay.
Hold on. Okay, we see you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So morning, everyone, and thanks for attending the session. I am Eneko BACHILLER, and I work in the fishery data collection and sampling team in AZTI. So I'm going to talk to you about small-scale fishery in our region, which is the Basque coast. And well, I will also describe some trends, let's say trends that we observed in the fishing effort of this small-scale fishery during the last decade. Regarding the last presentation, I saw that the term of optimization could even be better defined as the adaptation of the small-scale fishery, because this is also about changing the fishing technique or the gear throughout the year by the same fishing vessels to make the whole year more, let's say, cost effective. So in any case, that's a brief outline of my talk. I will first describe our area of study, and then we'll provide you some details about how we consider different segments of the fleets or fishing techniques, if you prefer. Then we made some analysis about some temporal trends in fishing effort and in terms of landed species and species composition. I will also show you some analysis about the landed fish length and also composition of species composition and the main target fish, depending on the fishing gears. And I will end up the talk with giving up some conclusions and a take-home message. So this is our area of study. It's a bit farther south from the previous presentation. It's at the southeastern corner of the Bay of Biscay. And although you see here many harbors, I will say that there are 3 or 4 of them in which most of the landings of the small-scale fishery happens in this region. So in any case, we will base the analysis on official data. So we consider just less than 15-meter over-length vessels based in our harbors and active during the last decade. And we excluded all missing information regarding landed fish weights and species composition. So this way, we got like more or less 67 vessel data and more than 47,000 fishing trips. Regarding the fleet segmentation, I will use for the analysis. These are the definitions. I guess you're familiar with them. So it's just hand lines targeting small pelagic fish. In our fleet, as I will tell you later, and you will see, it's almost all for mackerel during the mackerel season. Then long liners, in our case, are mostly bottom long liners targeting hake. So let's say hookers targeting the demersal fish. Then we considered gill nets and trammel nets all together because vessels using those passive gears use either gill net or trammel net, or even both, depending on the season or the targeting fish. And then pots and traps and trolling lines targeting albacore during certain seasons of the year. So if we consider all landings, regardless of the species, by fleet segment, you see here that more than the half of all landed species are coming from hand liners, followed by long lines, netters, and trolling lines. And pots and traps are just a really small portion of this pie chart. If we go through the temporal trends from 2010 to 2020, note this y-axis is cut because hand lines are by far much more in comparison with all other fleet segments. And it seems that there is like an increasing trend for total landing fish weights for handliners and also trolling lines, whereas the longliners, passive netter, passive gears, and pods remain more or less constant. So that's one picture. If we go into the detail for fishing effort, and for that I used the number of vessels exerting some kind of effort for each of the fleet segments, and also the fishing days. The fishing days were almost always like 1 day trip, but in any case, if we have a look to the fishing effort, then we see also quite similar trend, increasing trend for handliners and trolling lines, and a decreasing trend for trammel nets and gill nets. I want to highlight that this is not a picture of the fleet census, but just the number of vessels exerting some fishing effort. In other words, if a single vessel changes the fishing technique during the year and it uses, let's say, hand lines and then trolling lines in the same year, then it will be counted in both lines. So it's just to figure out more or less how is the fishing effort for the different techniques. So handliners and trolling lines increasing and netters decreasing. That's more or less the main message that we could guess from this picture. Well, this is another different analysis. This is just taking into account the overall fish length. If we take this chart or landed fish and we calculate just a mean length value of fish landed, well, there was not any trend for handliners and trolling lines, which is quite logical because handliners are just targeting single species, mostly mackerel, and trolling lines are targeting albacore. I will give you some more details later on. And in case of longliners and trammel nets, these analyses are giving an idea that the whole size range of the fish is becoming narrower and a bit smaller. That's regardless of the landed species composition. That's like a very general picture of what could be happening, but for that we could then provide some more details with another analysis. Well, this is another one. This is just to show, well, it takes the trips and puts in a special position depending on the similarities of the species composition. So that means that netters and handliners, netters and longliners are quite close to each other because they are targeting more or less similar fish species, whereas handliners targeting mackerel and trolling lines targeting albacore are just alone in this spatial plot. And the same could be said for pods and traps. So in other words, this is just to check that our fleet segmentation used for the analysis makes sense somehow. And this other analysis, that's perhaps a bit crowded slide, but I will just point out some main messages from here. First one is regarding the species diversity, considering the landed species from different fleet segments. And the main message is that the netters are increasing the species diversity regarding the landed species during the last decade. And then this constellographical representation, which basically shows the percentage of occurrence of each fish species in the x-axis and the percentage of abundance in the y-axis. So that means that in the top right corner of each panel is the dominant species or the dominant or targeted, the main targeted species for each of the segments. Then we show here the temporal trends, which are, well, basically, we could say that the trolling lines were highly selective just for albacore on all the years. So there is no change in targeting species, which is makes sense. Also for handliners, it happened the same in case for mackerel. Sometimes also chub mackerel appears, but normally mackerel is the main and targeted species. But then for handliners, for longliners, for netters and pots and traps, there is quite a little bit more diversity, but not big change from year to year. So let's say that the longliners are targeting mainly hake and conger, sometimes also sea breams. In case of netters, are also targeting hake, but other species like monkfish and red bullets or different species that are not so often taken by other fleet segments. And the same for pots and traps, which are targeting octopus, squids, and cuttlefish and crabs or lobsters, depending on the year. So these are also different from the other fleet segments. So as main conclusions, and to summarize a little bit all these previous results, we could say that there is, or it seems that there is an increase on the fishing effort, both in terms of fishing vessels and fishing days, exerting some effort for handliners targeting mackerel, and that's happening during spring in our region. And it could be, say, more or less the same for the albacore caught by trolling lines during summer season. So the length of both the mackerel and albacore seems to be the same. The length of the landed fish and the diversity, it's becoming lower, but that's just like it's pointing out that these two fishing techniques are becoming even more selective, let's say. In contrast, we have the gill netters and trammel nets, which are targeting completely different species. And it seems that they are landing a narrower and lower fish length ranges. And finally, the longliners, bottom longliners targeting mainly hake, conger, and sea bass, and also pots and traps targeting octopus and crabs are remaining more or less constant during the years, targeting the same species. So what we could conclude is that there is a kind of some adaptation, as I said, of some gill netters and trammel netters that are changing or at least exerting some effort during the mackerel and perhaps also albacore season. So they leave the nets and they go targeting mackerel and albacore during those seasons, and then turn back again to netters in other periods of the year. And that's all. Thanks for your attention. Hope you could follow the presentation with no problem.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Eider GRANER. I'll practice. It was terrible. In my head, it was going to be good.
So, hello everyone, and thank you so much. I'm Eider GRANER, and I work at the University of Brest in France. And I'm going to talk to you about a way of studying governance through a social network analysis and a graphic representation in the frame of the Fish and Tail project I am currently working in. So first of all, a very quick presentation of the Fish and Tail project is an Interreg cross-channel 2-year project that focuses on 7 pilot sites across the coastlines of Belgium, France, and the UK, here in the map. And the aim of the Fish and Tail project is to identify and protect essential habitats that are used by a selection of species in this area. Those species are bluefin tuna, European sea bass, crawfish, and pollock. And so to do this, louder? Okay. Okay. And so to do this, the added value of this project is the use of acoustic telemetry data and fish tags, so they can follow the movements and the fish behavior and better manage them then. And so to do that, we work very closely with local fishers of the area, and we study as well all the governance of the channel region. And so to do this, we have did an exercise by using the social network analysis, which is a way to understand a community or a system or individuals by mapping the relationships between them and all the links, and to understand those different types of the degree of the links that they share between each other, and at the end to understand how potential management proposals that we would made through Fish and Tail would influence this system and how it will affect to the current relationships between the different stakeholders. So to do this, we made a network graph using the SNA software, which is an open source software called Gephi. So to do this graph, we first divided all the stakeholders that we thought they were the most important ones in the region, in the French part of the English Channel. And we divided them in 3 main categories, which are the marine fisheries management stakeholders, the marine conservation stakeholders, and the mixed stakeholders, which do a bit of both, marine fisheries management and marine conservation. And between those 3 main categories, we have different types of stakeholders of different natures, have state services, professional fisheries organizations, MPAs, NGOs, etc. And I'm not going to go through details, but it's just all the stakeholders that we have identified. All the acronyms are in French, but it's written in English if you want to read that later. So we have a lot more marine conservation stakeholders, mostly because we have decided to include the Natura 2000 MPA managers, and there's a lot in this sector, and they have an influence more at a local scale. Then there's the fishery management committees, research organizations, and so on. So the methodology to do the graph, it's gonna be something like this. So we will have the nodes, which will represent the different stakeholders, and the edges that will represent the relationships between those stakeholders that are gonna be thicker or less thick in depending on the degree of importance. So in the graph, all the nodes are gonna be at different distances, and this has been made with specialization. That is the first atlas specialization that allows to that works as a principle of attraction repulsion of the nodes, something like magnets. So the stakeholders that share a large number of links are gonna get closer in the graph, and the ones that share few or no links are all gonna get more away. Then the nodes, the stakeholders are gonna have different sizes in the graph. This is calculated by the degree, which is the total number and the average number of links per node. And so in the graph, the more links a node has, the more connections and relationships the stakeholders has, the higher its place is going to be, its size, sorry, it's going to be in the graph. Then we have the color of the nodes. It's calculated by the methodology, the modularity, which is a quality index for community division, and it detects different communities within the networks. So where the nodes, the stakeholders are well connected to each other, and poorly connected to between them and to the other communities, they are gonna have different colors. So different colors is assigned to each community. And then at the end, the thickness of the links, this is calculated by the weight that we have attributed to those connections and relationships between them. So it's just one way of studying governance, and it's a bit subjective because we have assigned those weights based on what experts told us and literature review, etc. So we have different factors that we have identified and an assigned weight that we have considered to be the most accurate between those. For example, for same position and equivalent competences, for example, for ministries that have different ministries of fisheries and ministries of environment that have the same competences and equivalence but are not exactly the same. So we have assigned a weight of 2, for example, and that's how we attributed the weights and the degrees. So we cannot see the colors very well, but this is more or less the graph. So according to the modularity that I said before, it has divided them in 4 classes. So maybe it's better the other one. So we have one big orange that's here, which has pulled together all the marine fisheries management stakeholders, all the institutional stakeholders that are more in marine conservation have all been pulled here and here. Here we have the research institutes and the directorates of the sea at a regional scale that have been put. It's more the mixed actors, there's a bit of both, which have a quite central place. And here we have all the NGOs, or those are all the NGOs, the water management agency and the marine natural parks that are on the area that have been all pulled away here. And we can see that the OFB is the French Biodiversity Agency, is the stakeholder that has the most central place in the graph and that has the more links. Those 3 are the one that has the more links. So they are more institutional actors and marine conservation actors, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are the most important ones in the graph. It just means that they are the ones that have the more connections with different stakeholders and that we may target to, depending on what proposal we want to do. And those are the ones that doesn't have that many connections, but they have more diverse connections between the different categories of stakeholders. And so again, this is just a way of understanding these governance by putting it on a graph and by trying to have an image of how it would look like between marine conservation and fisheries management. And at the end, we want to know how proposals can affect this. And all the project is done according to the ecosystem-based fisheries management approach, which is an inclusive and holistic approach for the fisheries management. And so what we wanted to see is that how would those potential proposals affect the system that is already in place and the relationships between them. For example, we have an example of the crawfish management plan that has been made in Brittany at a very local scale. That was an initiative of the fishers, and so they had to balance between the marine conservation stakeholders, which was the Marine Natural Park, and the fisheries committees, and put together to do this closure of the fishing of the crawfish for a decade, and it worked. So it's more like how to find a balance and how to study all those connections between them and try to get a governance more inclusive. Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker is me, so that's good. I don't have any slides today, and this is on purpose. Sorry, not like poor Julia had to suffer through. Today, I want to talk about the future. And it's fitting to talk about the future at a conference about imagining, but you can imagine that we might talk about the future a little bit more at a conference about imagining. So my talk is called Imagine Transformation in Anticipatory Governance for Small Scale Fisheries. So I'm going to try to say this in a few different ways. In other words, this talk could be imagine governance that can imagine. Imagine governability for the future. Imagine decision-making and fisheries management that can manage beyond 3 to 5 years. So hopefully that invokes a few possible images about what I'm trying to talk about, because it will be a little bit conceptual, and it's not because that's the way it needs to be talked about, it's because that's where my thinking is at this stage. So I hope to engage with you a little bit more about these ideas in the hallway so I can learn from you and move this along, because the future is so important. I think implicitly, that's why we're here. So I'm going to be exploring 4 assertions, 4 arguments. The first is that there is an under-examined and practiced element in fisheries governance, and that's time, particularly governance that incorporates the future. And this is a sustainability problem in many ways because of rapid coastal and ocean change, among other things. That within that limited capacity, there is also a less than desirable incorporation of equity. And this, of course, in fisheries and oceans governance is a real problem for small scale fisheries. So when we think about these 2 problems, a sustainability problem and an equity problem bound up in the future, we can sort of say that without considering future rapid change in governance, as we've seen in the past, there really can be no sustainability or equity for small scale fisheries. And without foregrounding sustainability and equity in a more future-oriented type of governance, there may be no futures for small scale fisheries. At least we won't be able to help craft them and support them and advance them. So by exploring more holistic governance with these capacities for foresight, to anticipate, and maybe do something about the changes that matter for small scale fisheries with equity and sustainability in mind, then there is a significant opportunity, I think, to contribute to governance that can clarify and secure sustainable and equitable futures for small scale fisheries. Given the gaps in fisheries governance about driving sustainable and equitable future, as well as the importance of filling these gaps, I'm really trying to explore transformation here, how to actually make it happen in governance and how to make it happen towards building this capacity for foresight. So why do we need to think about transformative change in governance that affects small scale fisheries? Well, there is a significant gulf between government's commitments to sustainability and equity and the actual events on the ground. And this is by definition a problem. So even in the last day or so, we have heard about undermet commitments to the 2030 agenda, the need to do more implementation work with the SSF guidelines, the unsustainability of so-called sustainable blue economies and beyond. And in Canada, we would talk about commitments to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other sorts of commitments here. So, and I'm reading stories and experiences from many of you in I would call the TBTI library, where these commitments are undermet. And they demonstrate there's a long way to go to honor them, and that we need to be a little bit more proactive in the way small scale fisheries are governed to do that. Because they're struggling for their access to livelihoods, food security, and well-being, and through intersecting vulnerabilities associated with large-scale ocean and coastal development, giant marine protected areas, conflict with larger fleets in other sectors, rapid change in the markets, COVID-19, and of course, climate change. And in this context, fisheries governance has a set of tools to offer related to integrated planning, ecosystem-based management, marine spatial planning, management strategy evaluation. And some of these have been emerging for decades, some a little bit more newer. They all hold promise to integrate in some way across space, across activities, sometimes sectors, but not really across time, beyond some trend series, beyond management cycles, or in the case of Canada, we learned they anticipate really about who's going to be the next prime minister. That's how they start to formulate their decision-making. And more than that, these approaches, in the time that they do consider, rarely put the futures of small-scale fisheries at the heart of planning, where they should be, and where they can, by doing so, reveal all sorts of challenges and opportunities for fishing futures that we want, and for supporting a range of other marginalized ocean users. If you can imagine governance in which these commitments are integrated and implemented for small-scale fisheries, then you can also imagine honoring these commitments through principles, institutions, decision-making, knowledge about the future in the context of rapid change. More than that, if you can imagine and drive change in governance that can address rapid change for sustainable and equitable futures, then you can imagine transformation in governance that brings about the long-term visibility, recognition, and enhancement for small-scale fisheries. So I'm working on this problem, and maybe I've mischaracterized fisheries governance, although I'm not so sure. So I'm sorry if I didn't get it right. But I'm proposing to look at what's happening in governance through a lens of anticipatory governance. And this is not a new theory. It's also not just trying to replace other governance theories, although they have different ethos. It is a set of theories and methods and applications intended to draw attention to organizational capacity for bringing in the future and proactively doing something about it before things go wrong. So it encapsulates many diverse fields and theories and related to military and health applications, resilience, science, technology, and society, and also includes those governance theories and bodies of literature that do talk about the future. Interactive governance, for example, the policy sciences, to a certain extent, adaptive governance. So it's a broad church where everybody's welcome. And if you look across some of these fields, as I'm starting to do, you understand that this lens is about helping us understand what are the key challenges and prospects for governance to integrate the future. So I've said that. But it's not just about optimization, and I mean it in a different way than the last presentation, or doing a better job with change. It's goal-oriented. It's about how well governance incorporates the needs, values, and rights of small-scale fisheries, or the SSF guidelines, and steering change towards those things. And finally, it's about not just getting in a room like this and imagining, but securing those kind of practices in governance. Securing the use of scenarios that are not just about stocks, but about different kind of full spectrum kind of scenarios. Having people come around the table to talk about what about in 50 years? So I'm trying to still figure out what this actually means, but I think it's a nice avenue for me to start to think about some of the problems that I mentioned. And here's why. And I will go through four points that I think provide some opportunities for something like anticipatory governance as a lens for us to start talking about the future more. One is about the billions of dollars invested into sustainability and equity commitments. And so this is about how we try to honor those commitments long into the future. The second one is small-scale fisheries are an important illustration. As such, they represent a future we want. So we need a goal-oriented way of governing for the future. But if governance can advance small-scale fisheries futures, then we can start to think about also other marginalized actors. If we can do it for SSF, we can do it for all. Since it is a broad lens, I call it a broad church, linking many fields, Opportunities exist for transdisciplinary collaboration, but it cannot be without people in government that are making decisions. We have to help them build the capacity too, because we have all sorts of academic related ways of thinking about the future of Linga. You talked about some tools, yes, in Imagine Blue Justice. So the limited capacity to incorporate the future, particularly from justice and equity perspectives, I believe is a key source of vulnerability. So anticipatory governance is a lens that can help us understand and reveal existing, maybe create new governance capacities to clarify and secure long-term viability, as well as to address two problems of fit. One is about rapid change and the other is about equity. And often we talk about these things separately. And if we want to talk about the future and govern the future, we need to govern them together. So thank you so much for your time. Okay. So we have a few minutes for questions. If you want to talk to me about questions, we can do it in the hallway. Maybe there's a question for our virtual speaker who will not be able to join us in the hallway. No bites, but they can email you if something comes to mind. Okay. Are there any questions for Katia or any of the other speakers? I just lost the list in my head. Yeah.
I'll just pick up on something I heard in the first and second. You know, we often feel the urge to legitimize the existence of small-scale fisheries, and we do so by referring to the fact that they are making important contributions to society. And this is important, they do that, but it is a discourse with some ambiguity associated with it. Because it suggests that they're underpinning the whole thing is some kind of quid pro quo that, you know, we keep small scale fisheries as long as they contribute to whatever social goal there is. You know, small scale fisheries are not basically for themselves, they are for us, right? And as long as they deliver to us, we keep them. And as long as they do it better than anyone else, we keep them. And that is, it's a bit arrogant position to take. I would say. The other view is what comes out from Julia's perspective is that, you know, and from the human rights perspective, which is now part of the discourse about small scale fisheries, and I think the AZTI line was saying that you know, has actually contributed to now we talk about small scale fisheries from a human rights perspective. And that means that small scale fisheries have a right to be where they are. They have a right to do what they do, and they have a right to exist, regardless of what they contribute to society. As long as they are okay with themselves, as long as they can take care of themselves. This is a totally different kind of discourse. And I must say, I like that discourse more than this quid pro quo discourse that, you know, we keep them as long as they do what we expect of them.
Quick response.
Maybe I know. Yeah, I totally agree with your point, and I did mention about that there is one part of the discourse that they do make contributions to everything that the larger society. But that's not the only discourse that makes it possible to include them. So there are multiple other resources. So the take on that is there are different resources that combine to make meaning of small scale fisheries. So I also talked about how identity matters, should small scale fisheries and the communities exist for what they are striving to achieve, and that includes that identity there. That includes not the resource that we were talking about, but everything else. Because human beings, everybody needs to live in dignity. There is a rights angle, there is power angle, and all of those things makes it really important for small scale fisheries to exist, not just because they are making contributions. That was just one point. You can even argue that all these other things that makes small scale fisheries able to contribute. Those things are not made zero. If they have to live a life in lack of dignity and poverty and vulnerability, then they are not able to contribute. So therefore, you have to do something about that in order to you okay. So these things are connected, and they should be part of the same discipline, and not get as separate things.
All right, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for coming and listening to our presenters, and also thank you to our presenters for navigating the rough waters in this breakout room. Please enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you back after an hour. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.